The rifle hit the counter with a sound like a coffin lid closing. Isaac Underwood's hands did not shake. He had trained them out of shaking years ago, somewhere between the first man he had buried and the 10th, somewhere between the life he had wanted and the life that had found him instead. His hands were steady as stone as he laid the Winchester Model 1873 on the scarred wooden surface of Harlan Pruitt's general store, and he looked the storekeeper dead in the eye and said, "I want the red wool dress in the window, the one with the white stitching at the collar, and a pair of proper boots to go with it. Child-sized. She looks about 6, maybe 7 years old." Harlan Pruitt stared at the rifle like a man confronted with something sacred. He was not a stupid man. He recognized the Winchester. He had seen Isaac Underwood carry it for the better part of 3 years, through dust storms and droughts and the kind of winters that turned the Kansas plains into something that looked like the end of the world. He had never once seen Isaac without it. He had never once seen Isaac trade it. He had heard men say that rifle was the only thing Isaac Underwood truly owned in any permanent sense, the only thing he kept, the only thing he polished and maintained with the kind of quiet devotion most men reserved for God or family. "Isaac," Harlan said carefully, "that there is your last good rifle. I am aware of what it is. You sure about this?" Isaac did not answer. He looked instead toward the window where the red wool dress hung on a wooden peg in a shaft of pale December sunlight, and his jaw tightened in a way that spoke more than any words he might have offered. Outside, across the street, through the frosted glass of the mercantile window, he could see the small figure of a little girl standing in the cold in a dress so thin it was almost transparent with age and wear. She was trying not to shiver. She was doing a very poor job of it. Beside her, her mother stood with her arms wrapped around herself, watching the door of the general store with an expression on her face that Isaac recognized because he had worn it himself in darker years. It was the expression of a person who had run out of options and was standing at the edge of that particular cliff, staring down. Annie Whitaker had not asked him to do this. That was the part that would stay with him longest, he thought. She had not asked. She had not even hinted. She had simply stood in the cold outside Pruitt's store, looking at that red dress through the glass, and she had taken her daughter's hand, and she had said very quietly, so quietly Isaac almost missed it, "Next year, Clara, maybe next year." And that had been enough. That had been more than enough. Harlan Pruitt picked up the Winchester and turned it over in his hands, his expression complex, and he said, "I will give you the dress and the boots and $20 in trade." "Keep the $20, Isaac said. "Give me the dress. Give me the boots. Give me a wool blanket for the woman. She does not have a proper coat." Harlan looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly and went to get the dress. Isaac Underwood stood alone in the store, empty-handed for the first time in years, and outside the wind picked up and drove a fresh sheet of snow against the window, and he thought that a man could spend a long time being lonely before he finally understood what loneliness had actually cost him. He was 31 years old, and he had been running from something for most of that time, and he was only just beginning to wonder if running had ever gotten him anywhere at all. It had started 3 weeks earlier, on a Thursday in late November, when the Whitaker wagon had lost a wheel 4 miles outside of Caldwell, Kansas. Isaac had been riding the long way around town, the way he always did, keeping to the edges of settled places the way a man keeps to shadows when the light has become unfamiliar and uncomfortable. He had been in Caldwell for 2 weeks, ostensibly doing some work for the sheriff regarding a missing cattle shipment, though the work had concluded, and he had not quite managed to leave yet. That was another habit he had developed. Arriving places with a purpose, and then losing the purpose and staying anyway, drifting without quite drifting, staying without quite belonging. He had seen the wagon from a quarter-mile away, listing badly to one side, the wheel cracked clean off its axle on a frozen rut in the road. He had seen the woman climbing down from the seat, moving carefully, and behind her the small figure of a child wrapped in a pale blanket that even at distance looked inadequate for the weather. He told himself he would ride past. He did not ride past. He pulled his horse up alongside the wagon and looked down at the situation, and then at the woman, who had already assessed him with a calm, clear-eyed directness that he had not expected. Most women he encountered in these situations either looked away or looked frightened. Annie Whitaker looked at him like she was deciding something, like she was running a quick and efficient calculation behind those brown eyes of hers, and then she said, "I do not suppose you know anything about wagon axles." "Some," Isaac said. "Then I would be grateful for whatever help you can offer," she said, "and I will pay you for your time as soon as I reach Caldwell and settle my affairs at the land office." He noticed she said it like a promise, not a plea. He noticed the pride in it, the careful dignity. He got down from his horse. Her name was Annie Whitaker, she told him while he worked, not because she was particularly inclined toward conversation, but because she was a practical woman and she had decided he was not dangerous, and knowing each other's names seemed like the practical first step in a working arrangement. She was 28 years old. She was a widow. Her husband, Thomas Whitaker, had died of cholera the previous spring outside of Wichita, and she had spent the intervening months settling his debts, which had been considerable, and then taking stock of what remained, which had been very little, and then making the decision that she and her daughter Clara would take the homestead land that was being offered in the southern Kansas counties and try to build something from the ground up. A woman homesteading alone, Isaac said, not as a judgment, just as an observation. A woman homesteading with her daughter, Annie corrected him, which is a different thing entirely. I am not alone. Clara was 6 years old and possessed of the particular combination of shyness and bold curiosity that characterized children who had spent a great deal of time in adult company. She watched Isaac work from the wagon seat with enormous dark eyes, and when he glanced up at her, she did not look away, which he found oddly refreshing after years of people who could not meet his gaze without something complicated happening in their faces. "What is your horse's name?" Clara asked. "I have not named him," Isaac said. Clara considered this gravely. "That seems unkind," she said. "He ought to have a name. He would feel better for having one." "Clara," Annie said, in the tone of a mother managing a child's tendency toward directness. "She is not wrong," Isaac said. "I will think on it." He fixed the wheel well enough to get them to Caldwell, riding alongside the wagon in case it gave further trouble, and when they reached the edge of town he would have left them there and continued his drifting, except that Annie pulled the wagon to a stop and climbed down and held out her hand and said, "I meant what I said about payment. I have a small amount set aside, not much but honest." "Keep it," Isaac said. "You will need it for the land office." Something moved through her expression, not gratitude exactly. Something more complex than gratitude, the look of a person who is accustomed to carrying everything alone and has just been surprised by an exception. She said, "At least let me buy you supper." He said no. He rode away. And then he found over the following 2 weeks that he kept encountering Annie Whitaker in the ordinary commerce of Caldwell, Kansas, which was not a large town and could not really accommodate avoidance once 2 people had met. He saw her at the post office, where she was filing the paperwork for her land claim. He saw her at the feed store, pricing hay and grain for a spring planting she had not yet figured out how to finance. He saw her at the church, which surprised him, because he had not set foot in a church voluntarily in years, but he had gone for reasons he chose not to examine closely, and she had been there with Clara sitting very straight beside her, both of them with their hands folded, both of them with that quality of quiet determination that seemed to run through them like a shared current. He told himself he was not watching her. He was absolutely watching her. He learned things the way a man learns things, when he is paying more attention than he is admitting to. He learned that she had filed for 160 acres under the Homestead Act, that the land was about 8 miles southeast of Caldwell, that there was a small house on it already built by a previous failed claim, that she planned to move out there before Christmas and begin her improvements in spring. He learned that she was respected in town despite being a newcomer, that people spoke to her with a kind of courtesy that was partly her own manner reflecting back at them. He learned that she had been raised in Missouri, that she could read and write well, that she had taught school briefly before her marriage. He learned these things the way water learns the shape of stone, slowly and without any particular intention. He also learned, without meaning to, that she was struggling. The land claim had taken more of her savings than expected. The provisions she needed for winter were adding up to more than she had calculated. She said nothing about it publicly. She negotiated with merchants in her careful, proud way, and she stretched every dollar she had. And she did not ask for charity, and she did not appear desperate. But Isaac was a man who had spent years reading rooms and reading people, and he could see the strain behind the composure, the careful arithmetic happening constantly behind her eyes. He had his own money problems, of a minor sort. He was not destitute. He had enough saved from the sheriff's work and from various other jobs over the years to live simply for another few months. But he had nothing that could be described as abundance, and what he did have was the Winchester and his horse and a bedroll, and about $40 in the lining of his saddlebag. He was not a man who attached himself to places or people. He had learned, through a sequence of painful lessons, that attachment was a specific kind of danger that could undo a man more completely than any bullet. He had a dark past that he carried the way some men carry a scar, not always visible but always present, always felt in changes of weather. He had made choices in his earlier years that had cost people he cared about dearly, and he had spent a long time since then making sure he cared about as few people as possible, because caring was a liability. Caring was the thing that got people killed or hurt or broken in ways that did not mend cleanly. He was not supposed to care about Annie Whitaker. He cared about Annie Whitaker. It had happened so quietly that he almost missed it. Not in the dramatic fashion of stories, not a single overwhelming moment, but in the accumulation of small things. The way she spoke to Clara, always honest, never falsely cheerful, treating the child like a full human being with her own valid interior life. The way she had looked at him when he fixed her wagon wheel, direct and assessing, no performance in it. The way she had offered to pay him not as a formality but as a genuine intention, because she was a woman who settled her debts and kept her word and expected others to do the same. The way she laughed, which he heard once outside the dry goods store when Clara said something about a cat that had been following them, a real laugh, unguarded and warm, and Isaac had been passing on the other side of the street, and the sound had stopped him mid-step. He resumed walking. He kept his face neutral, but something had shifted and he could not entirely shift it back. The crisis came on a Thursday afternoon in mid-December. Isaac was sitting in the town's small saloon, nursing a whiskey he did not particularly want, when he overheard Harlan Pruitt at the bar telling someone that the Whitaker widow had come in that morning to buy provisions, and had come up short, that she had apologized very courteously, and put back the extra flour and the cooking oil, and had stood in the store for a moment looking at the red wool dress in the window before taking her daughter's hand and walking out. Isaac set down his whiskey glass. He sat with that information for approximately 4 minutes. Then he put on his coat and his hat and he walked out into the cold. He found them at the edge of the street, Clara pressing close to Annie's side, both of them watching the store window from the outside in the way of people who have accepted that the window is as close as they are going to get. And Isaac had stopped, and he had seen Clara's thin dress and the light coming through it almost like it wasn't there at all, and he had heard Annie say, "Next year, Clara. Maybe next year," and that had been the moment. That had been the moment that decided everything. He had gone into the store before he fully decided to go into the store, which was unusual for a man who prided himself on deliberate action, and he had laid the Winchester on the counter. And Harlan Pruitt had said what Harlan Pruitt had said, and Isaac had said what Isaac had said, and now he stood holding a brown paper parcel containing a red wool dress and a pair of child-sized boots and a heavy wool blanket. And he walked back out into the December cold, feeling lighter than he had felt in years, and also more terrified than he had felt in years, which was an interesting combination. Annie saw him coming across the street and something changed in her face, a series of micro-expressions that he was not quite close enough to read, and she straightened very slightly and watched him approach with that clear-eyed directness that had caught his attention from the first. He held out the parcel. "For Clara," he said. "There are boots as well." Annie looked at the parcel. Then she looked at his hands, and he watched her gaze travel to his side where the rifle normally hung, and her eyes came back to his face, and she said very quietly, "Isaac Underwood, what did you do?" "Nothing that needs discussing," he said. "That was your rifle," she said. "It was not a question." "It was a rifle," he said. "A thing, it can be replaced." "That is not true, and you know it," she said, and there was something fierce and complicated in her voice. "That rifle was not replaceable, and you know it." "Annie," he said, and it was the first time he had said her name directly, just her name, and the effect on both of them was immediate and visible, like a match struck in a dark room. He stopped. She stopped. Clara looked between them with the perceptive eyes of a child who understands more than adults expect. "Mr. Underwood brought me something, did he not?" Clara said. "He did," Annie said, and her voice was carefully controlled now, and she took the parcel from his hands with hands that were not entirely steady. "Come here, Clara." She opened the parcel right there in the street, because the child was there and the child deserved the moment. And when Clara saw the red dress, her face went through the full spectrum of 6-year-old joy, the disbelief, and then the recognition, and then the pure, uncomplicated delight. And she reached out and touched the white stitching at the collar with one fingertip like it was something miraculous. "It is the most beautiful dress in the world," Clara said solemnly. "It is a very fine dress," Annie agreed, and her voice had gone slightly rough at the edges. Clara looked up at Isaac. "Thank you, Mr. Underwood," she said, with the gravity of a child who understands that some gifts require more than ordinary thanks. "You are welcome," Isaac said. He looked at Annie over Clara's head and found Annie looking back at him, and what was in her eyes in that moment was not quite gratitude and not quite reproach and not quite something else, but a combination of all three that he felt in his chest like a physical weight. "Come inside out of the cold," she said. "Both of you." He wanted to refuse. He found that he could not. They went to the small boarding house where Annie had taken a room for herself and Clara, while she prepared for the move to the homestead. And the room was clean and spare, with a small wood stove and 2 narrow beds and Clara's few toys arranged with careful precision on the windowsill. Annie put the kettle on and sat Clara on the bed to try on the dress and the boots, and while the child was occupied with the serious business of becoming acquainted with her new clothes, Annie turned to Isaac and said, very low, very controlled, "You cannot do things like this." "I disagree," he said. "Isaac." She said his name the way he had said hers, and they both felt it. "I had a plan. I have always had a plan. I am going to make this work, the homestead, the land, all of it. I do not need someone to rescue me." "I know you do not need it," he said. "That is not why I did it." "Then why?" He looked at her for a moment. The fire in the stove clicked and hissed. Clara was on the bed examining the boots with enormous concentration. Outside, the wind was picking up again, pushing snow against the small window. "I do not know," he said, which was the most honest thing he had said to another person in a very long time. Annie sat down on the edge of the chair by the stove and looked at her hands. "Your rifle was the only thing protecting you," she said. "I still have my revolver," he said. "That is not what I meant." He knew it was not what she meant. He sat down across from her, uninvited but not unwelcome, and the stove crackled between them, and Clara started humming to herself on the bed, a soft, tuneless sound, and Isaac looked at Annie Whitaker in the firelight and thought that he had been lonely for so long that he had started to believe it was his natural condition, his permanent weather, the climate of himself. He thought that he had been wrong about that. "I should tell you something," he said. "You do not owe me your history," she said. "I know, I want to tell you anyway." She looked at him and nodded and waited. He told her about his dark past in the way he had never told anyone, not because she had asked, but because the room was warm and she was looking at him without flinching and he was tired. He realized, profoundly and specifically tired of carrying it alone. He had been a hired gun, not a killer for the sake of killing. He wanted that understood, but a man who had used his particular skills in the service of people with money and agendas. And he had not always asked the right questions about those agendas before agreeing to serve them. There had been a situation, 7 years ago now, involving a land dispute in Texas, and a family that had been on the wrong end of that dispute, and he had been working for the wrong side without fully understanding what the wrong side meant. And when he had understood, he had stopped. He had walked away, but walking away had not undone what his involvement had set in motion. A man had died. A good man, a farmer, leaving behind a wife and children. And Isaac had not been the one to pull the trigger, but he had been part of the machinery that had made it happen. He had been carrying that since he was 24 years old. He had become, afterward, a man who kept to the edges of things, a man who did his work with competence and then moved on before he could matter to anyone and before anyone could matter to him. Because mattering had led to that dead farmer in Texas, and he had not trusted his own judgment since. Annie listened to all of this without moving, without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "And you have been alone since then?" "Mostly," he said. 7 years, she said. 7 years, he agreed. She looked at him carefully. "Isaac," she said, "what you are describing is a man who made a mistake, a serious one, but you were 24. And you walked away when you understood, and you have spent 7 years punishing yourself for it by refusing to let anyone close to you." "That is a charitable reading," he said. "It is an honest reading," she said. "I am not a charitable woman, I am a practical one. And practically speaking, you are sitting in my room in the middle of December having just traded your most valuable possession to buy my daughter a dress, and I think we have moved considerably past the point where you can claim that your strategy of not letting anyone matter is working." He looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted in his chest, a complicated movement and adjustment like tectonic plates settling into a new configuration. "I suppose we have," he said. Clara appeared at his elbow, wearing the red dress over her existing clothes, the white stitching very bright at her collar, her feet in the new boots, and she said, "Do I look beautiful, Mr. Underwood?" "You look extremely beautiful," Isaac said with complete sincerity. Clara beamed. "I thought so," she said, and went back to the bed to examine herself further. Isaac looked at Annie. Annie was looking at him with an expression he could not fully name but did not want to look away from. She said, very quietly, "Stay for supper." He stayed for supper. The following week was something he would think about for the rest of his life, a 7-day shift in the atmosphere of everything. He did not stay at the boarding house, obviously. He had a room at the other end of town, and he went there at night and lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and tried to organize his thoughts about Annie Whitaker into something manageable and failed consistently. During the days, he found reasons to be useful. He helped her arrange the supply cart for the move to the homestead. He looked at the survey maps with her at the land office and identified the best location for a kitchen garden. He went with her to look at the condition of the existing house on her claim, riding the 8 miles out in bitter cold, and the house was small but solid, a single-room structure with a stone chimney and a dirt floor that could be improved. And Annie had walked through it with her hands on her hips and her chin up and said, "This will do fine," with such conviction that he almost believed she could make it happen by will alone. He was beginning to think she probably could. He told himself what was happening between them was practical, friendship, neighborliness, the ordinary social bonds of frontier life. He was helping a widow and her child prepare for a difficult winter on a new homestead, which was the kind of thing decent people did for each other on the frontier, nothing more complicated than that. Annie, for her part, said nothing that could be identified as romantic. She was warm and direct and occasionally funny, and she never spoke carelessly or performed anything for his benefit. She just was herself, clearly and without apology, and that was the thing, he realized finally, lying awake at 3 in the morning on the 14th of December. She was the most genuinely herself person he had met in years, and everything about him that had been calibrated to keep people at a safe, managed distance was failing in her presence because she had never once tried to breach his defenses. She had not maneuvered or performed or strategized. She had simply been real, and his defenses had, consequently, nothing to push against and had quietly collapsed. He was in significant trouble. He was sitting in this trouble, turning it over on the morning of the 15th of December, when he went to the general store for coffee and found himself walking into a conversation he was not meant to hear. The man's name was Dale Renner. He was a local rancher, thick-set and prosperous in the way of men who had come to the frontier early and had not been too delicate about their methods. He was talking to Harlan Prout in the unhurried way of a man who owns the room, and the conversation was about Annie Whitaker's land. "That section on the Cimarron Flats," Renner was saying. "I have been trying to acquire that parcel for 2 years. I had an arrangement with the previous claimant. And now this widow woman has filed on it and complicated everything." "She filed legal," Harlan said carefully. "Oh, certainly," Renner said. "Certainly legal, but legal is not the same as permanent, is it? A woman alone, no husband, no capital to speak of. These homestead claims fail more often than they succeed. You give it 6 months, maybe less with a hard winter." "You planning to help the winter along?" Harlan said even more carefully. Renner smiled in a way that did not involve his eyes. "I am simply saying that I will have a generous offer ready when she finds herself in need of an exit, at a fair price. I am not an unreasonable man." Isaac was standing in the doorway. He had not moved or spoken. Renner had not seen him yet. "Mr. Renner," Isaac said. Renner turned. His expression did not change much, which told Isaac that Renner was a man accustomed to being caught in conversations like this one, and had long since made peace with it. "Underwood," Renner said. "Did not see you there." "I imagine not," Isaac said. He walked to the counter and ordered his coffee from Harlan with the same unhurried manner Renner had used, because urgency was a thing you showed to people who had power over you, and Dale Renner had no power over him. "The Whitaker claim is solid," he said conversationally, while Harlan measured out the coffee. "She has filed correctly, she meets the improvement requirements, and she intends to fulfill her 5 years. I have seen the house and the survey. It is a good piece of land and she is a capable woman." "Are you speaking on her behalf?" Renner said. "I am speaking as someone who has reviewed the situation," Isaac said. "I am also speaking as someone who has a long memory for names and conversations. I want to make sure we understand each other." There was a pause. "We understand each other perfectly," Renner said pleasantly, and picked up his purchases and left the store. Harlan Prout set the coffee on the counter and gave Isaac a look that was part warning and part something else. "Renner is not a man to make an enemy of," he said. "I have made enemies of considerably more dangerous men," Isaac said, and paid for his coffee and left. He did not tell Annie about Renner immediately. He thought about it and decided that she would want to know, because she was a woman who dealt in facts and realities, but he also knew that dropping it on her without context or a plan would only add to a burden that was already substantial. He decided to gather more information first. What he found over the next several days was a picture that was complicated but not yet catastrophic. Renner was not a villain of the operatic sort. He was a man of business who had identified a piece of land he wanted and was prepared to wait for circumstances to break his way, and his method was patience rather than outright force. The previous claimant on Annie's section had given up after one hard season and sold to Renner at a loss, and Renner had made a calculation that the same sequence would play out again. What Renner had not calculated was Annie Whitaker. Isaac told her on the evening of December 17th. sitting in the boarding house room with Clara asleep on the bed and the stove warm between them. He told her directly, the way she deserved, all of it, the conversation he had overheard and his assessment of Renner and what it meant for her homestead. Annie listened with her hands folded in her lap and her face very calm. When he finished, she sat for a moment and then she said, "I knew there would be someone like this." "You knew?" 160 acres on the Cimarron Flats with water access and good soil and a standing structure already on it, she said. "It was listed at a price that was low enough that I could afford it. That always meant someone else had wanted it and could not hold it. I knew I would need to hold it." She paused. "Does he have legal means to contest the claim?" "Not at the moment," Isaac said. "Your filing is solid. He would have to wait for you to fail your improvements or abandon." "Then I will not fail," she said simply. He looked at her. The firelight was on her face, warm and shifting, and she was looking at him with that particular quality of hers, that clear-eyed determination that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than stubbornness, from a core that had been tested and had held. "No," he said. "I do not think you will." Something moved in the space between them, something that had been building for days and had not yet found its form. Annie looked down at her hands for a moment and then she looked back up and she said, "Isaac, what are you going to do next, after December, after you have helped me get settled?" The question was direct. He had known it was coming and had not prepared for it. "I had not decided," he said. "Have you thought about staying?" she said. "In this area, there is work here. The sheriff has spoken well of you. And the land adjacent to mine to the east filed last month, and the claimant did not complete the paperwork correctly. It might be available in the spring." He was very still. "You are suggesting I homestead," he said. "I am suggesting that a man with your skills and your stubbornness and your inexplicable generosity might find the frontier more rewarding than the road," she said, and her voice was very careful and very precise, and her eyes were not quite as calm as her voice. "Annie," he said, "I am not asking you to stay for me," she said quickly. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not that kind of woman. I can manage my claim on my own and I fully intend to. I'm simply pointing out that the option exists." "You are absolutely asking me to stay for you," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then slowly the corner of her mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the motion a smile makes before it becomes one. "Perhaps a little," she said. He reached across the space between them and took her hand. It was the first time he had touched her deliberately, intentionally, not the brief contact of handing over a parcel or guiding a horse. He held her hand in both of his and she let him, and they sat like that in the firelight with the wind outside and Clara sleeping and the stove ticking. And he thought that he had spent 7 years running from belonging and that the running had finally, completely exhausted itself. "I would like to stay," he said. She turned her hand in his and held it back, and that was how it began. The move to the homestead happened on December 21st, the shortest day of the year, which Isaac thought was either terrible planning or a kind of defiant symbolism, and knowing Annie, he suspected it was the latter. They loaded the supply wagon before dawn, Isaac and Annie working side by side in the cold, their breath white in the dark air, while Clara slept in the boarding house until the last possible moment, and then was bundled into the wagon seat wrapped in the new wool blanket with the red dress visible at her collar under her coat. The 8 miles to the homestead took most of the morning. The road was hard frozen and the wagon moved well, and Isaac rode alongside on his horse, which Clara had named Jefferson over a week ago, and which now responded to the name with a kind of resignation that suggested he had accepted his fate. They arrived at the homestead at mid-morning. The house stood in a shallow hollow that cut the wind, surrounded by frost-killed grass and the skeleton shapes of cottonwood trees along the creek that ran at the property's eastern edge. The sky was pale and enormous. The silence was of the particular quality that only exists in open spaces in winter, a silence that has weight and texture. Annie got down from the wagon and stood in the yard and looked at the house and the land and the sky, and her face was everything. It was everything she was, the hope and the fear and the determination and the love for the child behind her who was watching with wide eyes. She stood there for exactly long enough to feel it fully, and then she turned to Isaac and said, "Well, let us get the stove going." They spent 3 days making the house habitable, working with a focus that left little room for anything except practicality. But practicality at close quarters in a cold, small house with a shared purpose has its own intimacy, its own warmth. They patched the gaps in the walls with mud and straw. They set the stove properly and laid in wood. They hung a curtain that divided the sleeping area, which Isaac would not use because he slept in the barn he had started building from the materials Annie had purchased, working by lantern light in the evenings after Clara was asleep. He built the barn with the competence of a man who had done many things with his hands over the years, not perfectly but solidly. And Annie came out sometimes with coffee and watched him work, and they talked, not about anything in particular, not about the future or the past, just about the day, the work, the small events of a life in progress. On Christmas morning, Isaac came to the house with a package he had gotten from Harlan Pruitt's store some days before, trading a day's labor for it since he had no cash to spare after the rifle. The package contained a small book of illustrated fairy tales, bought for Clara, and a set of practical sewing needles and quality thread for Annie, which he knew she needed because he had seen her mending Clara's older clothes by the firelight with needles that were getting too dull for fine work. Annie looked at the needles and the thread for a moment, and then she looked at him with an expression that he had learned to read over the past weeks, the expression she wore when something had gotten through her composure without her permission. "Isaac Underwood," she said, "you are the most quietly thoughtful man I have ever encountered, and I do not know what to do with you." "You could try being patient," he said. "I have been told I require some patience." "By whom?" "Various people over the years." "All of them correct?" She laughed, and it was the same laugh he had heard outside the dry goods store weeks ago, real and unguarded. And standing in the doorway of her house on Christmas morning in the cold Kansas winter, he felt something settle in him like the last piece of a long disassembled thing finally finding its place. Clara came pelting from the bedroom corner with the illustrated fairy tale book held against her chest and said, "Mother, it has pictures of dragons." And the day went on from there. January came with the full weight of a plains winter, which was considerable. The temperature dropped to places that made existence a daily negotiation, and Isaac moved his sleeping from the unfinished barn to the house proper, because the barn was not finished, and the cold was serious, and Annie said, without visible embarrassment, that it was practical, and he said he agreed, and they arranged the curtain to maintain the propriety that neither of them was actually concerned about, because the real thing between them was larger and more serious than propriety, and they both knew it. He began to love her with the specific quality of love that comes to people who have been alone for a long time and have found something so improbably right that they are afraid to examine it too closely. It was not the dramatic love of younger years, not the kind that announces itself in grand gestures. It was the love that shows up in keeping the stove fed through the night so she does not wake cold, in learning how she took her coffee and making it that way without asking, in watching her move through her days with Clara, patient and funny and fierce, and feeling something in his chest that had been cold for 7 years gradually warming, gradually becoming functional again, the way a frostbitten hand warms slowly in the right conditions, not without pain but with the specific promise of restored sensation. Clara decided she loved him. She decided this in the uncomplicated, efficient way of children, and announced it one evening while Isaac was teaching her to play checkers, saying, "I have decided that I love you, Mr. Underwood," in the same tone she might have used to announce any other settled fact. Isaac looked up from the checkerboard. Annie, who was sewing by the stove, went very still. "Well," Isaac said carefully, "I am honored, Clara." "You do not need to be honored," Clara said. "It is just true. Are you going to be our family now?" The silence in the room was of the specific quality that occurs when a child has said the thing all the adults have been carefully not saying. Annie set down her sewing. Isaac looked at the checkerboard. Then he looked at Annie. Annie was looking at her hands. Then she looked at him, and what was in her face was the most unguarded thing he had ever seen from her, which was saying something because she was generally honest. It was hope. Just hope, plain and direct and slightly terrified. "I would like to be your family," Isaac said to Clara and also to Annie. "If your mother will have me." "Mother," Clara said. "Will you have him?" Annie Whitaker, who was practical and composed and did not perform things for other people's benefit, took a slow breath and said, "Yes, I will have him." Clara returned to the checkerboard with the satisfaction of a person who has resolved a matter efficiently. Isaac and Annie looked at each other over her head with the particular look of two people who have just made a very large and quiet decision, and the stove crackled, and outside the wind moved across the Kansas plain, and neither of them could find anything useful to say, so they did not say anything, and that was all right. The practical question of what this meant required addressing. Isaac raised it the following evening after Clara was asleep, asking Annie directly what she wanted, because he was done being indirect and she had never been indirect in the first place. "I want to marry you," Annie said. "If you are asking, I do not want something in between. I am not built for in between." "Neither am I," he said. "I was not asking about in between. I was asking if you would marry me." "Yes," she said without hesitation. "On the condition that you understand what you are agreeing to. This is not an easy life. This homestead is real and it is mine, and I will not give it up for anything. It is going to be hard for several years. There will be droughts and there will be failures, and we will have to rebuild things more than once. I am telling you this clearly because I want you to agree with full information." "Annie," he said, "I fixed a broken wagon wheel in a freezing wind for a woman I had never met, and then gave away my best rifle for her daughter. I am aware that I am not choosing the easy path." She looked at him for a moment with that expression he loved, the one that had a smile waiting just behind it. "No," she said, "I suppose you are not." He reached across and touched her face, his thumb at her cheekbone, and she leaned into it, a small involuntary movement, and he said, "I am all right with hard. I have been carrying hard alone for a long time. Hard shared is a different thing entirely." She put her hand over his. "Hard shared," she agreed. "Yes," he kissed her then. It was the first time, and it was the kind of first kiss that feels less like a beginning and more like the completion of something that has been building for so long it has become its own landscape. Warm and quiet and absolutely certain. The problem of Dale Renner had not resolved itself. Isaac had hoped privately that Renner's interest in the Cimarron Flats section might cool on its own, that with the claim looking solid and improvements underway, the rancher might redirect his acquisition ambitions elsewhere. By February, it was clear this was not the case. It started with small things. A fence post on the eastern edge of Annie's claim that had been knocked down, and not by any wind. A water dispute, Renner claiming that the creek at the property's eastern edge ran through his grazing rights, which was a claim that the county records did not support, but which required Annie to go to the land office in Caldwell and make her case with documentation, which she did, because Annie Whitaker was not a woman who ignored a legal challenge or failed to document a rebuttal. Isaac accompanied her to Caldwell for that meeting and sat beside her in the land office while she laid out her survey maps and her documentation with quiet, complete competence. And the land agent confirmed what the records showed, that the creek was within her claim boundary, that Renner's grazing rights did not extend to it. Renner's man, who had come to represent the rancher in this meeting, listened with a pleasantly neutral expression and said his employer would review the determination. On the way back to the homestead, riding side by side through a gray February afternoon, Annie said, "He is not going to stop." "No," Isaac said, "not on his own. What are you thinking?" She asked because she had learned to read the particular quality of his silences. "I am thinking," Isaac said, that what Renner is doing is mostly legal and mostly nuisance, and the response to legal nuisance is legal documentation. But I am also thinking that a man who plays the long game this patiently sometimes runs out of patience and tries something less legal, and I want to be ready for that. What does ready look like? He glanced at her. Partly it looks like making sure people in town know us and know our claim is solid. Community matters on the frontier. A man like Renner works best in isolation. He is less effective when his targets have neighbors and church communities and sheriffs who know their names. And I need to think about hiring help come spring, Annie said. Someone to help with the plowing and the planting. A hired hand for the season at least. We can discuss the money, Isaac said, and she gave him a sideways look because they were not married yet and the finances were still technically separate. But she also understood what he meant, that he intended to contribute to the construction of this life they were building, and she nodded. We can discuss the money, she agreed. They were married in March, in the church in Caldwell, with Harlan Prout and his wife as witnesses and Clara as the sole and extremely pleased member of the bridal party, wearing the red wool dress. It was a small ceremony, because neither Isaac nor Annie wanted spectacle, but the church was not empty, because people in Caldwell had come to know them over the winter and came to wish them well, and the sheriff was there, and several of the neighboring homesteaders who had introduced themselves over the previous months. Reverend Marsh, a compact and sensible man who had been performing frontier weddings for 15 years, said the words, and Isaac Underwood said his vows to Annie Whitaker with a directness and steadiness that had everyone in the small church very quiet, because the quality of his attention to her was something you could see from across the room, the quality of a man who has decided completely and without reservation. Annie said her vows back to him with the same clear-eyed conviction that characterized everything she did, and Clara, sitting in the front pew, nodded at each exchange of vows like a person checking items off a satisfactory list. When it was done, when the Reverend had said what needed to be said, Isaac kissed his wife in the church with a warmth that made Harlan Prout's wife press her handkerchief to her eyes, and Clara tugged at his coat sleeve and said, "Are you our family properly now?" And Isaac crouched down and said, "Properly and completely." And Clara hugged him around the neck with the force of a much larger person. Spring came to the Kansas plains with the particular drama of that geography, all sweeping sky and wind-driven cloud, and the sudden improbable green of the grass coming back to the flats after the winter. Isaac and Annie planted their first crop, with help from 2 neighboring homesteaders who came to help in the time-honored frontier tradition of shared labor. And Isaac worked the land with a focus and intensity that surprised even Annie, who had not expected him to take to farming so readily. But she began to understand, watching him, that what she was seeing was not so much farming as belonging, the specific and powerful satisfaction of a man who has finally found the place where his effort means something permanent. Renner made his last significant move in April. It came in the form of a formal legal complaint filed with the county regarding the disputed eastern boundary, a complaint that was largely without merit, but which required Annie and Isaac to travel to Caldwell twice and engage the services of a land attorney named Buchanan, who had recently opened an office in town. The legal fees were a strain and the time was a cost, but Buchanan was thorough and competent, and he dismantled Renner's complaint with methodical efficiency, and the county ruled in Annie's favor in May. Afterward, Isaac went to see Renner directly. This was not Annie's suggestion. She did not know he was going. He rode to Renner's ranch and asked to see the man, and Renner received him in his front room because Renner was, at bottom, a man of business who respected direct confrontation more than he let on. Isaac sat across from Dale Renner in a leather chair and said, without preamble, "You have lost every legal avenue. Your complaint was dismissed and documented." Any further action against the Underwood claim will create a public record of sustained harassment, which will have consequences with the county commissioners and with the land office, both of whom you need for your other operations. I am not threatening you. I am giving you information." Renner studied him. "You are a remarkable man to go from drifting gunslinger to frontier homesteader in 6 months," he said. "I had good reason," Isaac said. "The Whitaker woman," Renner said. "The Underwood woman," Isaac said mildly. Renner was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you want from me?" "I want you to move your attention to something else," Isaac said. "There is land to the north of your current holdings that will come available this summer. I have heard it is good land. I suggest your ambitions would be better served there." He could see Renner thinking. The man was not stupid. That was always the thing to remember about Renner. He was a calculating man, and a calculating man, when the calculation changed, could change with it. "I will consider it," Renner said. Isaac stood and put on his hat. "That is all I am asking," he said. He rode home through the spring afternoon, through the greening flats and the smell of mud and new grass. And when he came over the low ridge and saw the homestead below, the small solid house and the barn and the kitchen garden coming up in its rows and the creek bright in the distance, and Annie in the garden yard with her sleeves rolled up, and Clara nearby attempting to help with the weeding with the mixed success of a 6-year-old. He felt something expand in his chest so large and warm that he had to stop Jefferson on the ridge for a moment just to accommodate it. He had been lonely for so long. He had not known, while he was in it, quite how complete the loneliness was, how it had shaped every decision and every road and every dawn woken to alone in a tent or a boarding house or under a canvas sky. He had not known because you cannot know the full weight of a thing until you have set it down. He had set it down. He rode down the ridge to his family. By summer, the crop was doing well enough to justify cautious optimism, which was the only kind of optimism Isaac trusted. They had corn coming, and a kitchen garden that was producing more than they could eat, which meant trading surplus with neighbors, which meant the web of connections that made frontier community real and functional. The neighboring homesteaders, a couple named the Garfields who had come from Ohio, had become genuine friends, and their children and Clara had developed the particular fierce bond of children with few available companions, the bond that excludes nothing and shares everything. Annie was visibly happy in a way that deepened month by month, not the performed happiness of someone who has decided to be satisfied, but the kind that comes from a life that matches the shape of a person. She was good at this life, genuinely good at it, better than she had even hoped, and watching her figure out the land and the seasons and the community with that same efficient, direct intelligence she brought to everything else was one of the consistent pleasures of Isaac's days. He was also slowly becoming a person he recognized more readily. The dark past was still there. It did not disappear, and he had never expected it to. But it had lost some of its governing weight, the way old injuries do when they are not being continuously aggravated. He talked about it with Annie when it pressed on him, not often, but occasionally in the evenings, and she listened with the same quality of honest attention she gave to everything, neither dismissing it nor letting it define him, which was exactly what he needed and which he had not had before. In July, Annie told him she was pregnant. She told him in the evening after Clara was asleep, sitting across from him at the small table where they ate their meals, and he looked at her face as she said it and saw the combination of joy and anxiety that he had learned was her particular signature whenever something very large was at stake. He reached across the table and took her hand. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Afraid," she said. "Happy, mostly afraid currently." "That seems reasonable," he said. "Both of those things." "Isaac," she said, "we are just beginning. The homestead is not stable yet. The crop is good this year, but one good year is not a pattern, and a baby means—" "Annie," he said, "stop calculating." She looked at him. "I mean it," he said gently. "Stop calculating just for a moment. A baby is good news. Let it be good news for a moment before you inventory the complications." She looked at him for a moment more, and then something relaxed in her face, the calculating machinery quieting, and underneath it was the joy she had not let herself lead with, and she said, "It is good news." "Yes," he said, "it is." He came around the table and pulled her to her feet and held her, and she leaned into him with the full weight of her relief and her happiness and her residual anxiety, and he held all of it, the full complicated human load of her, and thought that this was the thing he had been running from all along. Not danger, not attachment. This specific weight and warmth and reality. The pregnancy progressed through the fall, and the harvest came in better than the cautious optimism had predicted, and Isaac sold the surplus in Caldwell and came home with more cash than they had budgeted for, which Annie immediately redirected into improvements, specifically a second room added to the house before winter, which Isaac and the Garfield husband built in a week of concentrated effort. Clara was fascinated by the pregnancy in the specific way of a child who has been told she is going to have a sibling and has decided this is a project she intends to be involved in. She had opinions about names. She had opinions about nursery arrangements. She had opinions about whether the baby would prefer the illustrated fairy tale book or the checker set. The baby will be a person, Annie told her, and will develop opinions of its own in due course. Of course, Clara said, but until it does, I will have opinions for it. Isaac, hearing this from across the room, found it necessary to look at the wall for a moment. Winter settled over the claim again, but this winter was different from the first. The house was warmer, the provisions were better stocked, the barn was finished and the animals were in it. And there was the particular quality of a place that had been inhabited through a full year, that had been worked and lived in and argued about and improved, that had developed the specific atmosphere of a home rather than a shelter. On a cold January night, with the stove going full and the wind outside, Annie went into labor. The birth was attended by Mrs. Garfield, who had experience, having had 4 children of her own, and it was long but not dangerous, and Isaac paced the outer room with Clara asleep on the bed beside him in the small hours, and when Mrs. Garfield came through the curtain and said, "A boy, healthy, good lungs," Isaac sat down on the floor of his own house because his legs had stopped cooperating. He went in and saw Annie, exhausted but present and real, her hair loose and her face bright with the particular incandescent satisfaction of a woman who has done something tremendous. And in her arms was a small new person, red-faced and emphatically alive, with his eyes closed and his hands in fists. "He has your stubbornness already," Annie said, her voice rough with tiredness. "You can see it in the fists." Isaac sat beside her on the bed and put his arm around her and looked at his son, and he felt something so large and pure that it had no name in any language he knew. "James," Annie said. "I thought James, if you agree." "James," he said. "Yes." Clara woke up when the light came and came barreling into the room and stopped very suddenly when she saw the baby, going from full speed to complete stillness in the way children do when something has broken through their usual momentum. She approached with enormous care and looked at her brother for a long time, and then she looked at Isaac and said, "He is very small." "He will get larger," Isaac said. "I am aware," Clara said. "I was just observing." And then she held out one finger to her brother, and James, by the unthinking reflex of new infants, closed his fist around it, and Clara's expression became something Isaac thought he would remember for the rest of his life, a love so total and unconditional it made everything else in the room pause. Spring came again, and with it the second planting, and things were incrementally better than the year before, as they would be each year building on the last, each year adding something to the foundation. Isaac filed on the adjacent parcel that Annie had mentioned the previous winter, the one whose previous claimant had failed to complete the paperwork, and the claim was approved, and they now had 280 acres between them, which was more than they had originally planned for and meant more work but also more capacity, more future. Dale Renner had, true to the unspoken agreement of that April conversation, moved his ambitions northward. There were occasional encounters in Caldwell when their paths crossed, and Renner was civil with the civility of a man who has made a rational business decision, and Isaac was civil back, and that was the end of it. The threat had been real and it had passed, and the land was theirs. The sheriff of Caldwell County had developed the habit of consulting Isaac on matters that required particular expertise, not gunfighting in the old sense, but the reading of situations, the assessment of people, the kind of knowledge that came from years of navigating difficult country and difficult men. Isaac did this work occasionally, when it arose, and it gave him a connection to the community beyond the homestead, a role that was useful and respected, and that he could inhabit without the old darkness that had attached itself to his earlier work. He bought a new rifle in the spring, a Winchester like the old one, bought with cash from the harvest. He did not feel the need for it the way he once had, but the frontier was real and the frontier had its hazards, and he was a man with a wife and 2 children and acreage to protect, and a rifle was a practical tool. Clara inspected it with the seriousness she brought to everything and said, "It is not as nice as the old one," and Isaac said, "No." But the old one served its purpose, and Clara nodded as if this was wisdom and moved on. That summer, Annie started teaching. There was no school in the area outside of Caldwell itself, and the neighboring homesteaders had children who needed education, and Annie had been a teacher before her marriage and had never stopped thinking like one. She organized a school day 3 times a week in the Underwood house, with 6 children attending from 3 families, Clara among them, and she taught reading and arithmetic and geography and the basic principles of natural history, because she believed, as she told Isaac, that knowledge was the thing most worth transmitting. Isaac watched her teach one afternoon from the doorway, sitting just outside in the September sun with James in his lap, the baby leaning against his chest with the solemn patience of a child who has been carried by this person for most of his life and considers it entirely natural. Through the door he could see Annie at the front of the room, her back to him, drawing something on the small board they had mounted on the wall, and the 6 children in their mismatched chairs watching with varying degrees of attention, and Clara at the front with her hand up already. And he thought that there was no version of his life before this that would have led him to predict this precise moment. This woman, this place, this child warm in his arms. This life that had been assembled from accident and decision, and an irreplaceable rifle left on a general store counter on a cold December day. He realized, happy. Not the complicated, qualified happiness of a man managing his expectations. The real thing. The whole unmanaged, uncomplicated, complete thing. That evening, after the students had gone home and Clara had done her supper duties and James had been put to sleep, Isaac and Annie sat on the narrow porch they had added to the front of the house, looking out at the long Kansas sky going orange and then purple above the flat horizon. The air still held some warmth from the day. Crickets were going in the grass. "Clara wants a horse," Annie said. "I know," Isaac said. "She has mentioned it several times. What do you think?" "I think she is probably ready for it," he said. "She has good instincts with animals. She named my horse Jefferson after knowing him for 4 days. Annie laughed, the real laugh unguarded. He had heard it hundreds of times now, and it still did to him exactly what it had done that first time outside the dry goods store, when he had been a man walking past on the other side of the street pretending he was not paying attention. "Isaac," she said. "Yes." "Are you happy here?" He looked at her. The last of the orange light was on her face, and she was looking at him with the particular expression she wore when the question was a real one, when she was not making conversation but actually asking. "Yes," he said. "Absolutely. Are you?" "More than I thought possible," she said. "When I was standing outside Pruitt's store in December 2 years ago looking at that red dress through the window and thinking we would have to wait, I was trying very hard to be all right and I was mostly succeeding, but underneath the succeeding I was afraid, Isaac. I was more afraid than I showed. I did not know if I could do this alone." "You could have," he said. You are more capable than you give yourself credit for." "Perhaps," she said. "But I am not sorry I did not have to." She took his hand, the same way he had taken hers that evening by the stove in the boarding house, deliberate and complete. "I am not sorry you stayed." He brought her hand up and pressed it against his chest, over his heart, which was doing something complicated and warm that he had given up trying to analyze and had simply accepted as the permanent condition of being in her presence. "I am not sorry either," he said. "Not for any of it, not even the rifle." "Especially not the rifle," she agreed, and smiled and leaned against his shoulder. And they watched the last of the color leave the sky and the stars come out over Kansas, one by one, in the vast and indifferent and strangely generous dark. Clara got her horse that fall, a small steady quarter horse named, predictably, by Clara, and named Clementine after a song she had learned at church, which seemed to Isaac to be entirely appropriate. She rode it with the natural competence of a child who has been watching horses her whole short life and has absorbed information through proximity, and Isaac taught her the formal elements: how to sit, how to use her weight, how to communicate with the animal through her hands and legs without fighting it. And she was a quick and earnest student in the way she was a quick and earnest student of everything. He taught her to ride, and he taught her to read maps, because maps had saved his life more than once, and he wanted her to have that capability. He taught her the names of the stars and the practical astronomy of the plains, how to find north and how to read weather in the cloud patterns, because weather on the Kansas plain was not a minor consideration but a governing force that could make or break a season. Annie watched these lessons with the satisfaction of a woman whose best instincts have been confirmed, and she added her own curriculum. The practical domestic skills that Clara needed, yes, but also history and literature, and the kind of thinking that asked not just what but why. And between the two of them, they were giving their daughter something that Isaac thought was genuinely rare on the frontier, both capability and understanding, both practical and interior. Christmas that year was the first one they celebrated fully at the homestead, the tree cut from the creek bottom and decorated with things Annie made from scraps of cloth and ribbon, and candles that were not left unattended, and Clara's red dress worn again, let out at the seams because she had grown. James was nearly a year old and had opinions about the tree, mostly involving wanting to touch it, which was managed with the patient redirection that had become a standard feature of their days. Isaac made Clara a small wooden horse, carved and sanded over several weeks in the evenings, and gave it to her on Christmas morning with the solemnity appropriate to a gift of genuine craftsmanship, and Clara received it with equal solemnity, recognizing the labor in it. He gave Annie a small mirror he had ordered from the catalog, because the boarding house room had a mirror and the homestead did not, and she had mentioned it once, very briefly, not as a complaint but as an observation, and he had filed it away. She held the mirror for a moment after unwrapping it, and then she looked at him and said, "You remembered that." "I remember everything you say," he said. She kissed him in front of Clara, who said, "I see you," in a tone of affectionate resignation. "You are meant to be looking at your wooden horse," Annie told her. "I am doing both," Clara said. They were going to be all right, more than all right. Isaac looked around the room that morning, at the tree, and the stove and the sleeping baby in his cradle, and his daughter examining her wooden horse with the complete attention she gave to things that mattered, and his wife standing with the mirror in her hands and the smile she had not entirely taken off her face since they were married, and he thought that there was a version of himself that had ridden past the broken wagon on the road to Caldwell, that had kept going, that had not stopped, that had maintained the long discipline of not caring. And he thought that version of himself had been enormously wrong, and he was glad, with the full force of everything he had become in the past 2 years, that he had not listened to him. The years that followed built upon each other the way good things build, each one adding depth and stability to what came before. The homestead expanded and consolidated. They added cattle, a small herd that Isaac managed with help from a young ranch hand named Eli who came to work for them the second spring, a boy of 19 from Missouri with good instincts and a willingness to learn that Isaac respected. The crops diversified. The house grew a second story, built carefully over one summer, which gave Clara a room of her own, which she decorated with the wooden horse and the fairy tale book, and a collection of pressed flowers from the creek bottom that she organized with taxonomic seriousness. James grew into a child of remarkable determination, which surprised no one who knew his parents, and then somewhat less remarkable patience, which also surprised no one. He had Isaac's build, which meant he would be tall, and Annie's eyes, which were dark and direct, and Clara's absolute certainty about horses, which appeared to be a family trait now. He learned to walk at 10 months and to run at 11 and to climb things that he should not climb at 12, and the subsequent months were characterized by a vigilance that kept both his parents in excellent physical condition. In the late winter of the third year, Annie sat Isaac down at the kitchen table with a specific seriousness that meant a real conversation and told him she was pregnant again. "How are you feeling?" he asked, and this time there was less anxiety in the question because they had done this before and he knew her capacity and she knew it, and the calculus of their homestead was more stable than it had been. "Good," she said, "genuinely good. And I am not going to stop calculating the complications because that is who I am, but I am also telling you that I am happy." "Then I am happy," he said. "Isaac." She reached across the table and took his hand in the way that had become their primary language for the things that did not require words. "I want to tell you something." "You can tell me anything," he said. "I know that," she said. "That is what I want to tell you, that I know that. That I have known it for a long time, that there is nothing I cannot say to you, nothing I need to manage or arrange before showing you, and I have not had that before, not in my marriage to Thomas, who was a good man but a private one, and not in my life before that. I just wanted you to know that I know it, that I feel it." He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the winter was doing its annual work on the Kansas plain, the wind finding every gap in the world and pushing through it. Inside, the house was warm and lit and completely his. "Annie," he said. "I was 31 years old and I had not belonged anywhere in 7 years when I met you on the side of a road in November. I traded my last good rifle for your daughter's winter dress and I did not think twice about it. And that was the moment I understood that whatever I had been telling myself about not letting anyone matter had run its course. You matter. Clara matters. James matters. This place matters. I want you to know that I know it." She looked at him with the expression that was not a smile but was everything a smile comes from, and she said, "I know." And that was enough. That was the whole entire thing, the summary and the conclusion and the ongoing fact of it. The third child was born in September, a girl this time, who came into the world with the same emphatic announcement that James had made and a full head of dark hair that made the midwife say something approving. Clara was 8 years old and took the role of eldest sister with the gravity of someone who has been planning for this and is now implementing the plan. James was nearly 2 and did not yet have a complete understanding of the situation, but was interested in the new person in a general way. Annie named her Margaret, after her own mother who had died when Annie was young, a fact Isaac had learned slowly over their years together, part of the careful archaeology of becoming fully known to someone. Margaret Underwood, with the dark hair and eventually Isaac's gray eyes, and Clara's judgment about horses, and James's specific variety of stubbornness, and something entirely her own that she would spend her life discovering. Isaac held her on the evening of her first day and stood with her in the doorway of the house, looking out at the September sky, which was enormous and orange and full of the light that comes only in early fall on the plains, and he held his daughter and thought about the road. He thought about all the roads he had ridden, and all the mornings he had woken to alone, and all the towns he had passed through and not stayed in, and the particular weight of a life lived at the edges of things, never at the center. He was at the center now. He had traded his last good rifle for a small girl's winter dress on a cold December day 2 years past, and in doing so he had traded the old life, the drifting life, the life of edges and distances, for this. For a woman who was honest and capable and who loved him with the same complete and uncomplicated certainty she brought to everything she believed in. For a daughter who had named his horse and told him she loved him across a checkerboard and who was growing into a person he admired. For a son who was going to run the world if given half a chance. For a daughter in his arms, new and complete and extraordinarily present. He thought about the man in Texas, the farmer who had died, and he thought that he would never fully put that down, nor should he, because some things are carried as a matter of responsibility rather than punishment, carried not as a weight that crushes but as a reminder of what matters and what costs. He thought that the best thing he could do with that responsibility was to be the thing he had failed to protect, a man present in his life, a man who builds rather than drifts, a man whose presence in the world makes it better in the specific places where he actually is. He was in this place. He was in this life. He was, completely and without reservation, here. Annie came to stand beside him in the doorway, leaning against his arm, looking at the same September sky. She was tired in the deep and satisfied way of a woman who has done something enormous and is beginning to feel the other side of it. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That I am grateful," he said. "For what specifically?" He looked at her. The sky behind her was all that September orange, and her face was warm and steady and fully itself. "For stopping," he said, "on the road to Caldwell. For not riding past." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I am grateful for that too." Margaret made a small sound in his arms, the particular sound of a newborn settling, and Clara appeared behind them saying that supper was going to be ready soon if someone attended to it, and James was already asleep in his corner, and the stove was warm, and outside the September light was fading to the deep blue that comes before stars, and Isaac Underwood, who had been a lonely man for so long that he had mistaken it for a permanent condition, stood in the doorway of his house with his daughter in his arms and his wife at his side, and his life arranged around him in every direction, complete and full and real. He had been wrong about loneliness. He had been wrong about what was possible and what he deserved, and what a man could become if he stopped running and chose, with full intention, to stay. He had been right about one thing only, that cold December day in Harlan Pruitt's store, when he laid his Winchester on the counter and asked for the red dress in the window and the boots to go with it and the blanket for the woman outside. He had been right that it was the correct thing to do. Everything that had followed, everything, had proven him completely and absolutely correct. The stars came out over Kansas, one by one, and the Underwood family moved inside to the warmth and the supper and the ordinary, extraordinary life they had built together. And the door closed behind them, and the night settled over the plains, and somewhere in the dark the creek ran along the eastern edge of their claim with the unhurried certainty of water that has found its course and intends to keep it.